Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel Prince Automation Destination. This side Prince. I hope you are doing well. So in our previous sessions of API automation series using REST Assured, we covered what is endpoint, what is method to perform operations on the endpoint. Then we covered parameters, wherein we covered query param, path param, and body param. We discussed the concept of request headers as well, and we discussed the commonly used request headers such as content type, authorization, etc. We discussed the concept of request body as well, which we used for creation of resource and updation of resource. In case you want to understand more on this, I would request you to please check out my previous videos, which I'll be sharing in icon. And today we will be talking about another important topic, that is authentication and authorization. So before understanding authentication and authorization in API term, let us try to understand from layman point of view. Suppose we are going to one office and we are carrying our identity card. So this identity card is the token to enter into the office, right? Meaning the guard at the door will be able to identify us with the help of this particular identity card, meaning he will be able to authenticate us, right? Once we are authenticated, meaning we are the valid employee of the organization, we can enter into the organization. Now after entering into the organization, there can be some areas where we may have access and we may not have access. So this comes because of authorization, meaning in some areas we are authorized to go and in some areas we are not authorized to go. So this process is known as authorization. So similar thing is applicable in case of request as well, meaning REST APIs. So when we make a request, we need to authenticate ourselves and we should be authorized to access that particular resource with the help of endpoint. Now let us try to understand this from the diagram. So suppose we have one application Udemy, and with the help of Udemy, after logging in, we want to access one course, right? So first what we will be doing, we will be entering our credentials by which we will be the server will be verifying our identity if we are the valid user. After we have entered, and if we are trying to now access a particular course, if we have purchased, we will be able to view that particular course. If we haven't purchased, we won't be able to view that course. So this process is known as authorization, right? Now there are different type of authentications and authorizations. So what is authentication? As we just discussed, this is a process of verifying identity of user or application making the request. Okay, and it's crucial as it ensures that only authorized users can access the API. Or we can say that when we are making a request, server checks with the API, who are you? So we show our identity card or we show the token that we are carrying, that we are this person, and then server will verify it, and based on that it will give access to the resource, right? So these are different type of authentications: basic authentication, API keys, JWT. Then we have a concept of auth 2.0 as well, which is authorization framework. Then what is authorization? So we will soon discuss about all these methods one by one. And what is authorization? Authorization is process of determining whether the authenticated user or system has access to the requested resource. So once we have entered into the application by providing the valid credentials, it's time for the server to verify whether we have access to that particular resource or not. Suppose sometimes user does not have the right access, so he may not able to perform the right operation on the particular resource, so he may have only read access, right? So this process is authorization, right? Now let us try to understand what is basic authentication. This is very basic type of authentication. In this type of authentication, we send username and password as part of API request in the request header, that is authorization header, and credentials are then encoded into base 64, and this type of authentication is insecure, so it should be used with HTTPS. And this is how the syntax will look like. Now let me go to the postman, right? So I'll be going to postman and I am going to create a booking, right? So I'm considering this particular sample example. This is a sample endpoint to create a booking. So I'm choosing body, right? And here we are passing first name, last name, and total price. So this is the body that is expected for this particular request, and we are passing it in the form of JSON, and the method is post, right? So if I, for example, hit this particular endpoint, I'll see one booking ID got created, right? Meaning the resource is created, right? Now, suppose we want to update this particular resource. So for that purpose, we'll have to go to update booking section and we'll have to provide this particular booking, right? And for update, the operation is put, and let us say we want to update some information. So if you notice in create booking, first name was Prince, last name was Kumar, and let us say we make first name as Prince 2 and last name as Kumar 2, right? And now let us try to hit this. So we see we are unable to update it because we haven't passed the credentials, and for updation purpose for this particular sample endpoint it needs authentication. So what I'll be doing is I'll be going to authorization section and I'll be choosing basic authentication and I'll be providing username and password. So this information we will get from the API documentation, and it all depends which type of authentication is implemented. So for this particular sample endpoint, basic authentication is implemented. So if I go here on this particular website which has all these endpoints, so it has given this information that these are the credentials that we can pass as part of API request. So same thing I have done, right? So I have selected basic auth and I have passed username and password. And as soon as we have selected this basic auth and we have provided username and password, if I go to header section, I'll see one authorization header. And if I'll click on this eye icon, I'll be able to see this particular syntax, right? So this is what we discussed, like this is how it will look like. Now let us try to hit this and see whether we are able to update this or not. So you see we got success status code and we see the updated information, first name Prince 2, last name Kumar 2, right? So this is how we can utilize basic authentication, right? Now we have understood this, let us recap it with the diagram, right? So first of all, what we are doing is we are making a API request, right? And then server is asking us to provide the credential, and then we are sending the username and password, and in response server will process the request and give the response, right? So this is a basic authentication. Now moving on to API key, this is another type of authentication and is more secure than uh, basic authentication, right? So what is API key? API key is a unique identifier that an API provider issues to the registered user in order to control the access to the resources. It can be obtained by going into the API key section and providing certain permissions. So we can get API key first, right? Either by hitting the endpoint with the credentials or by going into the portal and we can generate the API key. During generation of API key, we need to provide certain permissions which we want to give it to the API key, because API key here will work like a user, right? Because after we have created the API key, we will be passing this API key along with every request, and that will work like a identifier, right? So what is the prerequisite in order to use API key as a authentication? Client should have API key. As we discussed, we will be creating the API key first. So client should have API key. Client could be Postman, rest assured, anything, right? So it should be sent with every request. Once we have API key, so whichever request need API key, in order to access the resource, we need to pass API key. And API key can be sent in many format. It can be sent as query parameter or as an authorization header. So when we send it as authorization header, we need to provide the token, and before token we need to prefix either bearer token or API key depending on how it is developed, right? Meaning how the API is developed. Is it expecting bearer or it is expecting token or API key, right? So we can pass any of these prefixes. Now there are some instructions when we are dealing with API key. We should store the token confidentially. If it is compromised, we should revoke the token and we should regenerate the new one for further interactions. And API key should also be used along with HTTPS, right? Now let us go back to the Postman example. Suppose instead of basic authentication, the API key authentication is implemented here, right? So in that case, what we will do is, first of all, I'll make it as no auth, right? And I'll go to header section. One option is we can provide it into header. So first we discuss about header, then we will go to the query param, right? So here what we will do is we will provide authorization header, right? So authorization header, and let us say as per the API documentation, they are expecting API key, right? So what we will do is we will provide API key as a uh, prefix, right? And then after, whatever the API key that we have already generated, let us say it is 12345 ABC, right? So we need to pass like this, and if we will hit this particular request, so this is how we will be able to pass the API key. So this is one way, right? If it is bearer, we can provide bearer, right? So this is one option. Another way is we can go to authorization header, and if we are sure that it is going to be bearer as a prefix, we can select bearer token and we can simply provide the key here. So 12345 ABC, right? So it will also look like this, but if I go here now, I'll see one authorization header and it has already prefixed bearer in front of it. So if we are sure that it is going to be a bearer, we can select it from authorization section. If we are not sure, we can manually add the authorization header and then we can insert the prefix, right? Now there is another option as well. Suppose we want to send it as a query parameter, right? So as we just discussed, that API key can be sent as a query param or as a authorization header, right? If we want to pass it as a query parameter, so we need to simply pass question mark and API key equal to 12345 ABC, right? So this is how we can find or pass API keys to the different in the different ways, I mean, right? So these are the different ways we can pass API keys, right? So this is the diagram. Let us recap with the help of diagram. So client should have API key which he can generate by going into the portal or by hitting the endpoint with the help of credentials. Once the API key is generated, he will be sending the API key along with the request. Then in turn, this server will check with the upstream server and will verify the key that is sent is the valid key and has access to the resource. It will send back the response to the downstream server, and this downstream server will then process the request based on the status of this API key. If it is valid, it will process the request. If it is invalid, it won't process the request and simply will give the error status code. If it is valid, then it will give the positive response and we will be able to get the actual response, right? Now let us discuss about JWT. So JWT stands for JSON Web Token. It is compact, safe and stateless mechanism for API authentication and is most widely used. So here, similar to API key, we generate the JWT, but mechanism of JWT generation is a bit different than API key. When we generate the JWT token, at that point of time, it contains some user information related to user identity. It encodes this information and then it signs it with some algorithm, right? Meaning with some mechanism, okay? And then it generate the token and hand it over to the user or the client. Client then will use this JWT in authorization header in the subsequent request. And when we will be sending the request, server will validate this particular JWT and will check there is no tampering on this particular JWT token. Okay, if everything is okay, then it will process the request and will send back the response. As JWT contains every information, so server doesn't need to store any information related to user, because in JWT we contains the JWT contains the user's identity and user related claim. So server doesn't need to maintain any information related to user, and as a result the server becomes stateless. So that's why JWT is a stateless mechanism for API authentication. And JWT is not safe by default. However, it can be secured by following guidelines. So we can use strong algorithm, we can use secure secret key, and we should use it over HTTPS, and there should be some token expiration for access token. We should store the token at confidential place so that no one can reach it or use it. We can use encoding, and if we got to know that token is taken care or token is stolen, then we can revoke it. Then we should use the concept of refresh token, which is used to again get the access token. Refresh token is generally having more life than the access token, And this is the concept used in authentication and is one of the most widely asked interview question as well. What is access token and refresh token? I'll be discussing this in the later session, right? So this is what is JWT, right? Now let us go back to the same postman example, right? So how we will use it into the postman. So suppose JWT type of authentication is implemented here, right? So what we'll do, we will simply go to bearer token, and here what we will do is we will simply provide the JWT token. So let us say the JWT token that we got is this one, right? So what will happen is it will add one header similar to API key, and it will add this particular JWT, right? So when we'll be sending the request, server will check this particular bearer token and will check if it is tempered or not, and will process the request accordingly. So let us understand from the diagram, right? So client first will hit the authentication endpoint, and it will get the encrypted JWT, that too signed by the JWT server, right? Now in the next request where we want to access the protected resource, we will be passing the JWT. As a result, we will be getting the response, right? So here when we'll be sending the response with JWT, JWT validator will validate that there is no tampering on JWT, and accordingly it will process the request and will respond back to the client. So this is how it works. So this is what I wanted to cover, guys, as part of this lecture. In the next lecture we will try to understand OAuth 2.0, where we generate either JWT token or OPIC. So JWT token along with OAuth 2.0 becomes an industry standard, and most of the organizations are using OAuth 2.0 along with JWT. So this is what I'll be discussing in the next lecture.